Thank you to ICI for being a meeting partner. You'll notice that there is a change in the agenda from what was previously promoted. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflict, we're unable to welcome the speaker from Enbridge. Instead, today you'll be hearing from my colleague Joel Johnson as he provides an abbreviated version of what we call the Energy 101 Roadshow that we give to folks across Minnesota and parts of North Dakota to talk about energy and electricity, and Joel will kind of talk about that. But really, we developed this program in Minnesota to share with policymakers and their staff about the complexities of energy and electricity. So Joel's going to share to you the presentation that we give so you kind of have a feel for how to talk to elected officials and policymakers and kind of with the message that we share. Joel is the Minnesota Director of the Coalition for a Secure Energy Future. In addition to his duties with the Coalition, Joel is also president of One Minnesota Government Affairs, a lobbying and public affairs company based in St. Paul. Joel brings a wealth of energy, legislative, regulatory, and public affairs experience. Please give a warm welcome to Joel Johnson.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks for everyone who's here. What I'm going to do, and we're going to go through the presentation that we give to local chambers and Rotary groups, as well as policymakers in St. Paul, the legislative staff and the legislators themselves. And then also what we've been doing more of late is giving this to the local congressional offices and all the staff in those offices. As Luke mentioned, we've been doing this now for 3 years. I think he and I probably have put on close to 15,000 miles traveling around the state of Minnesota, and some in North Dakota as well, talking to chambers, Rotaries, Lions, any local group that will have us really. And then also providing education to legislator and policymakers, trying to get into their offices before they have to tackle some of the more complicated policies that come up during the session. So really at the outset, we always like to try and explain who we are and why we exist. We talk about where our funding comes from through the Lignite Energy Council, so that we're upfront about where we're getting our funding from. And then we talk about what we're trying to accomplish, which is really to convey the complexity about the electric industry. Usually at this point, I like to tell people a little bit about my background and how I got involved in the electric industry, which was as a newly appointed member of the board of directors at the Minnesota Valley Electric Cooperative in Jordan, Minnesota. And I just talk about how I had these assumptions coming in about the electric industry, and as I got involved in the industry, as I did my homework, as I find out how complicated it is for the electricity to reach my home, it shares kind of a personal story with the groups that we're at. We also talk to them about, the generally prevailing attitude among really all Americans, which is we really don't think about where our electricity comes from until we turn on the light switch and the light isn't there, or we look at our bill and the bill is higher than we think it should be. From there, we kind of move into just kind of a basic view of how electricity arrives at our homes and businesses. On the left-hand part of the slide represents electric generation. In the bottom, the brick building represents the centralized plants. We go a little into the history of how that developed, how utilities moved towards more larger and centralized plants to capture the efficiencies of scale. We talk in particular about how utilities decided to place a lot of the plants that provide electricity to Minnesota in North Dakota on the Lignite energy fields, because particularly, right on how economic it was to put the plants right where the coal deposits are. In the higher portion of that, we talk about the buildup of peaking plants, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, and the impact that those had on the market in Minnesota. And in particular, with this one, we try to emphasize how what really drives really drives electric prices is the building of new generation. And that peaking plants were a reflection of the desire for utilities to avoid, to put off those major capital investments until really needed. And then we talk about the growth of renewable and intermittent resources on the grid, and some of the impacts that that's had on the way the grid operates and on prices as well, and the impact on the market. In the middle represents the high voltage transmission lines that bring the power from the centralized plants to where it's needed. Here, further on, we'll go into some of the developments, particularly the CapEx process, and how important that's been to the grid over the last 10 years. And then on the right side, it represents the local distribution grids. And we talk about mainly here, the point we want to make is, when the grid was designed, it was a one-way system. Utilities built it to deliver electricity, and there really wasn't a whole lot of thought about electricity coming back onto these local grids. And then we move into how that is really changing now, how the increased use of smart grids have driven a lot, what smart meters actually mean, and kind of the history of those. And then we also talk about the growing influx of distributed generation on the system and some of the challenges that poses for utilities and for the way that we pay for the local grid. Here we just mainly go over how Minnesota compares to our neighbors, and North Dakota compares to its neighbors in terms of its energy mix. This slide is a little bit dated, and we acknowledge that up front, and just kind of talk about how Minnesota in particular has a pretty balanced portfolio, and that balance will be increasing moving forward. Here, this is a slide about electric cooperatives, but during this portion, we go over the different types of utilities there are that operate in the state of Minnesota. The three types are investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, and electric cooperatives. The key points that we continue to stress when we're talking about all of these different types is, one, the diversity, not just between those three, but the different utilities within each of those categories. You look in particular in Minnesota, we're served by right now 3 investor-owned utilities, Xcel Energy, Minnesota Power, and Otter Tail Power, and how different their customer bases are, about their needs, even about when they experience their peaks on the system. With the municipal utilities, with their great diversity, we kind of stress in particular the strains that really heavy-handed state policy have on the smaller municipals across the state of Minnesota, some of which have fewer than 500 customers. And then with electric cooperatives, again, we stress the diversity among their their member base, just in terms of, and their difference from the other types of utilities in terms of having mainly residential and farm members that they provide electricity for, and the challenges that in turn provides. Again, another one of the key messages that we try to stress with everyone we talk to is how heavily regulated utilities are. We go into a little bit of the history behind that, of the bargain they made for receiving exclusive rights to provide electricity in service territories, and their acceptance of pretty heavy regulation from that. We go through the list of all of the different federal agencies that have regulatory authority over utilities. We talk about the regional authorities, and then in particular the state authorities that have regulatory control over utilities and the different ways that they regulate the different types of utilities. From there, we kind of pivot onto a discussion of independent system operators, how they were developed, what the rationale was behind them, and how the markets have kind of evolved over the past 2 decades, and kind of explain how the process works, how generators bid into the market at prices, some of the challenges that we're seeing with, in particular with so much wind coming into the system at specific times of the year and at specific times of the day when demand is low, and the challenges and some of the distortions that's having in the marketplace. This is one of the areas that we really find people are pretty fascinated and really know very, very little about. I think most people have assumed that utilities just set their rates at whatever they want, and the cost of electricity is based on that. And so this has been, I think, real valuable to us. It's also a valuable discussion because I think it demonstrates, really visually that the electric market is not limited to state lines, that it really is a regional market, and that it's most valuable for us or state policymakers to keep that in mind when they're setting policies. From here, we kind of go into a discussion. One of the things that we always try to stress to whatever groups that we're speaking to is how rapidly the electric industry has changed over the last really 3 decades, and how a lot of the change is expected in the next 20 to 15 years, and some of the market forces that are driving that, as well as other forces. One of the key things that we want to stress is that a lot of the changes that are taking place in the electric industry are changing because of various changes in the way in market inputs. And the biggest, I think, all of us in the room will acknowledge is the impact that low natural gas prices have had on electric generation. We like to point particularly in the northeast part of the country and how the rapid change there out of the type of generation being used and how the market is really driving those changes. Again, we also talk about how natural gas combined with the lower cost of wind and other variable types of energy are really driving a lot of the decision and changes that utilities are making. Another key concern or driver of the changes is concerns over CO2 emissions. You know, really one of the things that you do here and try to do here is talk about how the industry has addressed previous challenges. I always go back to the 80s and how the main concern for utilities at the time was addressing mercury emissions as well as the key drivers for acid rain and then fine particulates. And we talk about how as soon as the way that the industry responded, how technology really has for the most part addressed all of those concerns, and then as that was happening, how the environmental community then turned to carbon dioxide emissions as their key concern. We talk about how that's been the rationale for most of the major policy changes at the legislature, and how it's been used as a rationale to drive or push for changes to the existing fleet of generation, particularly in Minnesota. Again, you know, I think one of the things that we try to communicate, and I think one thing that people don't really realize is how what a good job the industry has done in reducing emissions like NOx and SOx and mercury. This chart, I think, really pushes that well. It's from, I believe it's from the Minnesota Department or Pollution Control Agency. It just kind of shows the reduction in SOx and NOx. SOx is the lighter blue one over the years, and how you really can't, this really is not the coal plants of the 1950s. And I think one of the struggles that we've had, in particular in Minnesota, is the environmental community wants to base a lot of its arguments on what coal plants used to look like as opposed to what coal plants look like today. From there, we talk about some of the federal and state regulations and kind of the history of how we've seen really kind of a flipping over the last 10 years away from legislative policy, the legislature driving policy, to really it coming more through the regulatory process. And that's true both federally and at the state level. And we talk again about you know, how the industry is going to address concerns today, and that will have little impact on the proposals that we see in the future. We talk a little bit, in particular, at least of late, of some of the easing of the regulations at the federal level. We talk about the reconsideration of the Clean Power Plan, some of the retraction of the other climate-related rules, like the lifting of the moratorium on coal mining on federal lands, the elimination of the social cost of carbon, WOTUS, and others. But I think the key point we want to make here is that while these changes and reconsiderations are welcome, I think the industry really is viewing this as more of a pause than a complete policy reversal. I think we stress that most utilities see going forward that they're going to be living in a carbon-constrained world. And so, again, I think the key point, another key point here, is that what's valuable about the recent actions, is it allows some of the industry to work on technologies that are going to address a lot of the concerns that were in the Clean Power Plan. And also how if there was a really, probably the biggest problem with the Clean Power Plan was the timetable and the unrealistic timetable. And again, that this is allowing the industry to respond to calls for it to reduce carbon emissions. From there, we kind of move on to what the future is going to look like in the electric industry. And again, you know, as I tell everyone when we reach this slide, predicting the future is always a dicey proposition. But we go through the list kind of that we're going to see more conservation and efficiency. One of the key things that we like to share with people is how when we went into, when the economy went into recession in 2008, electric demand, as it always does during recessions, really cratered. But how, as we've come out of this latest recession, demand hasn't increased the way that economic activity, or hasn't mirrored the increase in economic activity the way it has in past recessions. And so we kind of talk about how much of the conservation we're seeing now is really happening organically, both in the home and at businesses and industry. We talk about how the changes in standards for electric motors and generators and lighting and et cetera have really reduced the amount of energy being used by both industry and in the residential setting. The question about more demand, whether we're going to ever see it increase the way that it was before. We talk about new gadgets and uses for electricity, and in particular about the potential of shifting the transportation industry or electrifying it, and what that could mean. We talk about a little bit about how important it is that if we do make that shift, that we have policies in place that really take advantage of the abundance of electricity overnight and the inexpensive energy during off-peak periods of use. We talk about the likelihood of seeing more increased distributed generation, how the cost of solar has been dropping significantly, the increase in community solar, and a little bit about how the way that Xcel's community solar program has driven a lot of that at perhaps an unsustainable level. The potential of storage, talk a little bit about what the utility integrated resource plans show for the 2030, and then the potential for new generation technologies. And from here we go through, in particular, two of the next two slides during most of our presentations are probably generate more excitement than any of the others. And when I say that, you know, for me, talking about the electric industry is always, I enjoy doing it. I find the industry fascinating. That isn't shared by everyone. I know in particular when I try to talk to my girls about what I do, their eyes roll back into their heads after a couple minutes. But it is amazing how even 15, 20 minutes into a presentation, you begin to talk about new technologies, in particular the alum cycle, and the potential this has for changing the whole debate on carbon dioxide emissions, how excited people get about this technology. And I think that reflects kind of just who we are as Americans. I think people are really craving for conceding there's not going to be a silver bullet. People do really get excited about technological fixes, and they really do believe that it's possible for the industry to do this. We also talk about the Project Tundra that is on the drawing board right now. Again, this is just another thing that when people hear about it, they get really excited about that. And then depending on what audience we're in, if it's on the legislative level with legislative staffers, we'll go into state initiatives, state policy, what we see coming down the road in the next year. This is what we've been talking about with the congressional offices. Some of the proposals that have been introduced in the House and Senate on the 45Q tax credit, talk about some of the other the implications of the wind production tax credit expiring, and then other funding for carbon capture utilization research and funding, and some of the other things that are going on in the industry. So that's really kind of where what we've been trying to do across the state, working at a grassroots level. We've found really great success. I know that Dick Ellis and I have had lunch with a lot of you talking about what we're doing, building up a grassroots infrastructure. So in the event that we do face adverse legislation in Minnesota or adverse regulatory processes in Minnesota, that we can get more voices arguing in favor of the industry, explaining how some of the challenges the industry face, and really having local constituents who know the industry, who work in the industry, talking to legislators about the impact of some of the proposals that are out there. We haven't had to use the grassroots network so far. For the past couple years in Minnesota at least, we've seen, for the most part, the legislation that we have seen has been positive and supportive of the industry. This past year we saw a couple of bills that are redirecting the Public Utilities Commission to focus more on costs and to also consider more of the infrastructure costs that adding a lot more intermittent resources will have on the grid. And so, but going forward, depending on what happens in the 2018 elections, it's likely that we are going to need that grassroots infrastructure going forward. And so I'd like to thank all of you who've offered support and access and who were willing to, sign up for our Employers Toolkit. And at this point, I'll take any questions that you may have about what we're doing, what the challenges are we're facing in Minnesota, or what the key challenges likely will be. I mentioned over the past, probably the last 8 years of the Dayton administration, we've really seen a movement away from the Dayton administration trying to set energy policy via the legislature, and instead using the PUC and other agencies to advance their energy proposals. So again, thanks for all your support. Thanks for continuing to pay attention to the legislative and political process in Minnesota, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Well, I don't see anyone, so again, thank you. I think we're going to, again, break for some networking and back. And thanks again.
Thank you, Joel. Just one reminder, don't forget to fill out your scavenger hunt. There's some pretty great prizes, as I mentioned this morning. There's a DeWalt drill, among other things. At this time, we were supposed to have Travis Fisher from the Department of Energy here to give information about the grid reliability study. Unfortunately, they had a hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday that was last minute in front of the Senate Committee on Energy, and so he was unable to travel here to make that. But Jason Bohr, the president of the Lignite Energy Council, will give a brief update on the grid reliability study and some of the things that Travis is going to talk about before his panel later this afternoon after lunch with the CEOs. We're going to take a quick break for a little bit, and we'll be joined by Lori Shaw from Colstrip United. So feel free again to network, grab some refreshments, and we'll be back here shortly.